Seated this morning as we look at Daniel chapter 5. We are reminded of the book of Daniel and some of the familiar stories that we find in the book of Daniel. I hope that by now you have recognized that this, of course, is the story of the writing on the wall, the mysterious hand that appears one night to King Belshazzar and his party. Some time ago, the investigators were called in to determine why a plane had crashed. And there were two of these investigators, and they began to dive into all of the wreckage and began to interview all of the survivors, and they began to talk to the people who were responsible for taking care of this aircraft. And so they began to come together and they began to compare their notes. And the one investigator, he was young. He had only been working for a very short time. The older one had been there for a little bit longer. The younger one, he was very eager. He began to go through all the facts, and what they began to discover, really, it actually shocked them very much. What they discovered is that on the first reason that this plane went down is because the people who were responsible for maintaining the aircraft had not done their job. They had not maintained the aircraft. They had not done the inspections that were required. There was a lot of obvious places where they had cut corners. One of the other things that they found is that as they were preparing to get this craft into the air, they realized that there was bad weather. The second reason that this airplane went down was because there was poor weather that forced the plane to actually go down as well. But the third thing that they discovered, and this is what shocked them, is that the pilot had full knowledge of the maintenance records and had even had full knowledge of the weather report. And the young investigator, he's shocked, and he says, how could this have happened? How could the pilot have done this? And finally, the other investigator put his hand on his shoulder, and he said, oh, he did not see the writing on the wall. What amazes me about this story is that it is the foundation of that saying that we use in order to reflect the reality that sometimes people cannot see what is plainly the plain warnings that exist within their lives. And I'm afraid that as we look at this passage, we are going to see a story of a king who could not see what was happening all around him and who did not appreciate the economy of time. The title of the message this morning is King for the Night, the economy of time, in Daniel chapter 5. So what did happen? What did transpire there in Babylon during this time? One of the things that we first learn is that Nebuchadnezzar is no longer the king of Babylon. Now, if you're just reading through Daniel, you might get the impression that Belshazzar just kind of followed up Nebuchadnezzar, that Belshazzar was in fact Nebuchadnezzar's son. There's two reasons we think that. Number one, he comes in the progression of Daniel. He comes after Nebuchadnezzar. The other reason is because many English translations tell us that Belshazzar was Nebuchadnezzar's son. Most of your translations say that Belshazzar was Nebuchadnezzar's son. But there's something interesting about that word son in Daniel chapter 5, is that it could be translated son or it could be translated descendant. And I think that's important because when you study history, you realize that Belshazzar was actually Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. There's one other fellow in between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, a guy by the name of Abidominus. I think I'm saying that correctly. I'm probably butchering that name. But I say all that to say, so that we can understand that Belshazzar, while he is not directly Nebuchadnezzar's son, he is in fact his descendant. And he should have full knowledge of Nebuchadnezzar. Now this is going to come up again. This is important to keep in your mind, to keep in the back of your mind. Let me say it again. Belshazzar should have been aware of his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar. Anyway, so what happens is Belshazzar has a party. He's there in Babylon. He is wanting to celebrate. He's wanting to have a good time. So he invites all of his officials, all of their wives, all of his wives. And they have a big feast, it says. Now, even in the ancient world, there was somewhat of a party scene that would transpire. This was one evening, one fateful evening, when Belshazzar came together and had this big party. And as Belshazzar is sitting there, he looks around and he says, I've got a great idea. Let's go into the royal storehouse, and in there are all kinds of treasures from the various kingdoms that my grandfather Nebuchadnezzar conquered. And so the Bible tells us that as they began to go through them and as they began to draw them out, some of those things were actually the instruments and the articles that Nebuchadnezzar had carried out of Solomon's temple. And to make matters worse, they began to take these sacred objects and they began to fill them with the food and the wine that they were eating and drinking, and they began to eat and drink out of the vessels of the temple. And the way the story unfolds here in Daniel chapter 5 is as if someone has had enough. And there in an instant, a hand appears and begins writing on the wall. Now, if you read the story very carefully, you realize that this was not just something that happened in the corner where you might have missed it. No, it says that this hand appeared and began to write right next to the candle. In the room, somewhere, in various places, would have been a big candlestick. And something that would have illuminated the entire room. This is where they saw it. And the reaction was fear and trembling. The text literally says that Nebuchadnezzar's skin began to grow pale, his teeth began to chatter, and his knees began to click. He was scared to death. And he asked the question, what does it mean? What does it mean? Somebody tell me, what do these words mean? Because even in the state that he was in, even after doing what he had done, I think Nebuchadnezzar knew that this was some kind of message from beyond. This was some kind of divine wake-up call. He understood that this was a vision that needed an interpretation. And so, as was custom, he began to call all of his officials, all of his smart people. They had a little conference, and they began to look, and of course nobody is, sorry, Belshazzar, we just don't know. We have no idea. We don't know what it means. But in fact, the queen finally speaks up and says, I remember a guy by the name of Daniel who had the ability to interpret dreams under your forefather Nebuchadnezzar. So beginning in verse 13, Daniel is brought in. Nebuchadnezzar begins to question him, tells him, and then finally asks him to interpret the words that have been written. Promises Daniel that he'll make him the third ruler of all of his kingdom. So Daniel begins to speak in verses 17 and following. And of course he says, Belshazzar, keep your stuff. Keep your stuff. And he begins to tell he begins to remind Belshazzar about what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. And so last week, you remember, Nebuchadnezzar had been told, after receiving his own vision, a tree that was cut down, that he, even though he was such a great ruler, literally the ruler of the world of that time, that he would be humbled if he did not humble himself before the King of Heaven. Of course, he did not. He prided himself on his stuff and of his accomplishments. And in that moment, the kingdom was taken away from him for a period of time until he finally humbled himself before the God of Daniel. It, of course, was restored to him, and he was restored to the kingdom. And at least in the book of Daniel, he lives happily ever after until his death. But here, Belshazzar has, well, he hasn't learned that lesson. He hasn't learned it at all. As a matter of fact, beginning in verses 22 and following, he begins to tell Belshazzar that, and did you catch that as we were reading those verses? You have not humbled yourself, but you have exalted, which is the opposite of humbling. But not just exalted himself against the Lord of heaven. In other words, Daniel identifies that Belshazzar has crossed a line, not with him, but with God. And that there were going to be consequences. The consequences, of course, are written all over the wall. And beginning in verses 25 and following, Daniel begins to interpret what those words mean. And he says there in verse 25, this is the inscription that was written out. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Peresh, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and to the Persians. Belshazzar hears this. I'm amazed that he doesn't lose his mind, but maybe he does a little bit. He, in a very absurd fashion, keeps his promise to Daniel to make him a ruler, the third ruler of Babylon. Clothes him in purple, gives him the honors of that was all do this. But the irony is that this is short-lived, because the king who is trying to make Daniel like a king, well, he's not going to be a king very much longer. The Bible tells us that very night, he was slain. And Darius, there in verse 30, became he inherited the kingdom as a Mede. Now, there's a lot of history that's going on here. There's a lot of details that we can talk about. But what I think we should focus on here as we think about, especially the economy of time, are these words that Belshazzar saw written and that Daniel interpreted. And so, this morning, with what time we have left, we're going to think about what these words mean in the context of Daniel chapter 5, but what they also mean about how we understand time, the use of time, and the passage of time. And so the first thing that we got to do is that we got to count it. We got to count it. Listen, I'm going to go ahead and give the points to you this morning. The first thing we got to do is we got to count it and realize that time is up. The second thing we got to do is we got to weigh it and realize that time has value. The third thing that we have to do is that we have to divide it and believe that time marches on. Let me say that again. We got to count it, we have to weigh it, and we have to divide it. Now, when I'm talking about time here and the economy of time and the worth of time, I'm not talking about the accumulation of maybe some of you have a collection of pocket watches or watches at home. I'm not talking about the value of those watches. I heard one time that when they discovered the Titanic, one of the things that they began to discover were the various pocket watches that went down with that ship. And they found all kinds of pocket watches. They found expensive pocket watches that belonged to some of the most richest people in the world at that time. Watches that even in their heyday would have fetched great sums of money. But they also found pocket watches that belonged to commoners. They found pocket watches that were not as expensive and were not made of the greatest materials, but yet at the end all of these went down, and all of these watches were at the bottom of the ocean in the one ship, and it didn't matter if that watch was found on the top deck or the bottom deck. It didn't matter if that watch belonged to a rich person or a poor person, because at the end of the day, and when that ship went down, those pocket watches read the same time. And I hope you're beginning to see that one of the reasons that the story of Belshazzar and the writing on the wall is so compelling is that what happened to him and for him. Let me say that again. Happened to him and for him is the same thing that God is trying to do for us as well. Now, for Belshazzar, that story was sad. It hit him like a ton of bricks. So the question is, how can our story, how can we use the economy of time to escape the fate of Belshazzar? How can it turn out better for us? Well, one of the things we got to do is we got to do the same thing that Belshazzar needed to understand. You see, I think one of the reasons that the handwriting came when it did, how it did, is because time was up for Belshazzar. Belshazzar, from history we know, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. What happened after Nebuchadnezzar is that his son came to the throne, but one of the things that he was having to contend with was, in fact, this coalition of the Medes and the Persians. They invaded Babylon, the land that we think of as Babylon, and basically split it in two. Nebuchadnezzar's son was in charge of one side of the kingdom, and Belshazzar in Babylon, the city, took the other side of the kingdom. And these were uncertain times, because the Medes and the Persians were moving through the land, and the kingdom of Babylon was on borrowed time. Eventually, Nebuchadnezzar's son would go into exile, and he was gone. And it just left Belshazzar. And I believe that Daniel chapter 5 tells us the story and recounts the night that all of that fell apart. And it fell apart when they were partying. But did you catch the fact that what they did in the midst of the party, as if they had all the time in the world, if you catch the sense of the story, and if you know the history of the world at this time, the armies that were coming to sack Babylon were literally knocking at the gate. And this guy Belshazzar, he is clueless in his leadership, and he is clueless in his leadership of the people in the days that are dark and trying. And in the top it all off, he begins to disrespect the gods of all the nations that the Babylonians had conquered. Something Nebuchadnezzar would have never done. Even though he was a disciple of Marduk, even though he kind of went back and forth on the God of Israel, at the end of the day, Nebuchadnezzar never disrespected the peoples that he conquered. But Belshazzar forgot the lessons of Nebuchadnezzar. And I believe he forgot a lot of things, and I believe he made a lot of foolish mistakes. But don't miss this. Daniel chapter 5 is not an assessment of Belshazzar's political career. It is an assessment of his spiritual state. Because in the midst of that, what went to his head is that he thought that he could, as the Bible says, exalt himself against the God of heaven. The question is, did Belshazzar understand what he was doing? Yes, he did. He knew what it meant to go into the storehouse. He knew the significance of these instruments of the temple. He knew that to use them was a desecration. He knew that this was a line that was being crossed. The attitude that Belshazzar here is either of utter stupidity or of crass resignation to the end. Either, and this is not a question that I can answer. I'm not sure. Either Belshazzar was a complete fool who hated God, or he had resigned himself, believing there is no God, to do whatever he wanted, with whatever he wanted, in the days that he had. Either he's foolish and dumb, or he is smart and smug and cynical. I'm not sure which it is. But here in this story, the thing that is pointed out is the fact that Belshazzar has exalted himself against God. I think he is being cynical against God in such a way that he is saying that he is going to do whatever he wants with whatever time he has left. And what he doesn't realize is that he doesn't have much time at all. Notice what it says there in verse 26. The words that are on there are words that are numbers, actually. These words have verbal roots, and this is where Daniel draws the meaning. The word mine, for example, usually referred to the counting of money. Here he is saying that God has counted your kingdom and put it to an end. He is saying that God has counted all the days of your kingdom, all the periods of your influence. And just as it had a beginning when you commenced, now it will come to an end. That's what is meant here. And the wisdom of these words, and the lesson that Belshazzar did not learn, is that every person, they are counted a portion of days. God knows our beginning and He knows our end. He knows our birth. He knows our death. He knows everything in between. He even knows the hairs upon our head. Ladies and gentlemen, my brothers and sisters, let us not miss the wisdom here. If we are going to appreciate the economy of time, even in 2022, we need to realize that there is going to come a day and a moment for every person when that number is up. Time is up. Time's up. And it comes for all of us. The second thing is that this time is weighed. That is what is meant by tikel. You have been weighed. Now in the ancient world, when you went to the market, most of those sellers would have had some kind of scale in order to weigh what it is that you had to trade. Perhaps you had some gold to trade for whatever it is that you wanted. And they would say, okay, well, I need such and such weight in gold. You begin to count out that gold against their scale, against their weights, and you're hoping that seller is honest. But if you got to the end of how much gold you had, and that scale had not balanced, that seller would look at you and say, I'm so sorry, you do not have enough. And that's what's happening with Belshazzar. The time that he has spent, the way he has spent that time, the kind of man he was during the time in which he was given. It is being weighed and it is being found, did you catch it? Deficient. Deficient. And so as we humble ourselves, realizing that time is counted, is limited, we need to understand that it is also being weighed. The truth is every person, just like Belshazzar, their life is being weighed according to the standards and the scales of the living God. The question is it enough? Is the life that we have lived, is it enough? We'll come back to that here at the end. The last thing that we need to do is to divide it I think that in verse 28, the force of the verse, especially to the ears of King Belshazzar, is that the kingdom was going to be divided, but then it was going to be given away. In other words, what is being said here is that before he loses the kingdom is going to lose its cohesion. Things are going to fall apart before the end. And if you know anything about the fall of the Babylonian Empire, you know that despite its greatness and the accomplishments during its height, there at the end, it literally fell apart in such a way that when the forces of the Medes and the Persians finally breached the walls of Babylon, the people there within the city walls welcomed the Medes and the Persians. They said, "Come on in." There's probably more that we could say about verse 28, but the thing that this story shows is that though time was over for Belshazzar, it was time for a new king and even a new kingdom. Now, this is a theme that is going to be repeated and has already been shown in the book of Daniel. Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar when he was interpreting the vision of the statue, he said that you are the head of gold, but after you will come another kingdom, and then after that another kingdom. He said time will go on, and kingdoms will rise, and kingdoms will fall, kings will come, and kings will go. Time will continue. Time marches on. That's a saying we have as well, and time will certainly march on here. The humbling thing is that we need to realize that after today, time will march on, but there is coming a day when time will march on without us. Without us. Belshazzar needs to learn that. He needs to learn it real quick. We're not told if Belshazzar had a moment where he said, "Oh, Daniel, I'm so sorry. I'm right. I mean, you're right, and I'm wrong." And we don't. It happened so fast that the only thing that it seems like he has the chance to do is to honor Daniel. Now, maybe that's an indication. You know, he could have killed Daniel. He could have thrown him into, I don't know, maybe a lion's den or something. He could have done something to Daniel in response to that message. It couldn't have been easy to tell Belshazzar that his time was over, his time was spent. But what happens here in this passage is that Belshazzar's time does in fact come to an end. And it's tragic and it's sad, because what we understand is that his time has come to an end, but it was deficient. He didn't measure up. And that's what he did as he was going into eternity. So this morning the question is, what about our life? How do we avoid the fallen Belshazzar? Well, first of all, I think, and this is the first application, I think we need to learn the wisdom of the economy of time. We need to understand that things begin and that things end. That is one of the lessons of history. That is one of the lessons of Scripture. That just as you and I have a birth date, we will also have a death date as well. As just as you and I have seen things come and seen things go, we need to understand that all things come and all things will eventually go. Now, the good news in all of this is that there is a promise of a kingdom that will last forever. Of a king who will never abdicate his throne. Of a time in eternity that will last forever in the glory of God for the people of God. So we know two things. We know that this progression of time, of beginnings and end, it's not just going to keep going on forever. Time itself will come to an end. Time itself will end. That is the lesson here. We need to understand that there's coming a kingdom. Let me say it again. A kingdom that will last forever. A king who will never abdicate. A time of eternity filled with the glory of God for the people of God. So what we need to understand and what we need to ask then is, okay, Belshazzar obviously missed that. He missed that wisdom. He missed that realization. Of course, as believers, as followers of Jesus, that's what we think and that's what we believe. But how do we get that? How does that become the reality for us? How do we look forward to the end of time? How do we look forward to the end of our time? How do we look forward to the end of things, even in this world? And the good news and the reality is that we need to understand that in Christ, this kingdom that lasts forever, this king who will never abdicate, well, it's Christ's kingdom. And it's Christ himself. You see, unlike Belshazzar, King Jesus understands the economy of time. You remember that story? Jesus is there at the wedding in Cana, and everybody's having a good time. There's no handwriting on the wall in this story, but they do run out of wine. And Mary comes to Jesus, says, "Jesus, they've run out of wine, you know." And Jesus, he turns the water into wine, and it tastes better than any of the other wine. You know the story, but sometimes we forget what Jesus first told his mother. He looks at Mary, his mother, and he says, "Woman," he says, "what does that have to do with me? Don't you know that my time has not come yet?" Now, I don't have time to explain exactly what that means or what everything that's going on, but just understand that Jesus knew, even during his earthly life, that there was a time where he could enjoy the wedding, but there was also a time where he had to endure the cross. Folks, the economy of time for the believer is understanding that the king who will never abdicate his throne is the Lord of time itself. Did you catch what Daniel told Belshazzar? He said, you have forgotten the wisdom of Nebuchadnezzar. You have forgotten to humble yourself. You have exalted yourself before the God of heaven. But you have also forget. Did you pick up on that? The one who what? Holds your life. And even has determined the course of your life. Now, I don't know about you, but what that means is, as we learn the wisdom of the economy of time, one of the things that we need to understand, again, and you're going to get sick of me saying this, but he is in control. And he is still on his throne. And he is still in charge. So you may get to the end of your life. Or you may witness the end of something that you don't want to end. I'm sure there were people who cried over the death of King Belshazzar. As we reach these ends, as we come to the end of these things, what is it that fills us with hope? Hope for not just eternity, but hope for